Hello fellow cartilage enthusiasts, and welcome to today's video, in which we will be discussing a series of increasingly obscure psychoactive drugs and their histories, dosages, effects, and some fun facts laid out in iceberg form. By now I'm sure you're aware of what an iceberg style list is, but for the sake of this and following videos, we're going to be presenting our entries based on tiers. Each tier consists of widely varying drugs that are grouped based off of public knowledge, awareness, and accuracy of information regarding certain drugs. Now keep in mind that this is by no means a comprehensive or exhaustive list, particularly because there are a seemingly infinite amount of psychoactive compounds, be it by discovery of a new plant, newly documented ingestion of a previously known chemical, or synthesis of a new compound entirely. There could literally be 5 new drugs discovered the day after I post this. So, rather, this list serves as a highlight reel for sharing important and captivating information regarding drugs that I think are especially fascinating. Now, a few notes before we get started. First, I made this iceberg myself, so each tier and entry are based on my understanding and personal experience of how well known each compound and its details are. So, if you disagree in how I rank their obscurity, damn. What can I say? Secondly, I am generally speaking excluding certain types of drugs that, while they may potentially have psychoactive properties in some users, are either inconsistent or not well documented. Although, trust me, within this list, which I've generated off of several drug databases including the Psychonaut Wiki and the DEA's scheduling list, we're going to be covering just about every drug you could want to imagine. However, some of the general classes I'm not going to be heavily touching on are those categorized as antidepressants, inhalants that's main cause of effects are oxygen deprivation, muscle relaxants, certain antihistamines excluding anticholinergic compounds and popularly combined ones like promethazine, and other drugs that have little to no perception-altering effects whatsoever. Finally, there are a lot of compounds on this list, and I aim to give a detailed report on them, so this list is going to be broken up into several parts. However, keep in mind that I cannot possibly divulge every single detail of each compound. Instead, I am giving my best attempt of giving a hearty summary of interesting and important facts. Finally, I do not condone the usage of any of the compounds that are listed. However, I also do believe blindly condemning any drug can be equally as harmful, and I believe education is typically the best road to ensuring better decisions and judgment for our society. This first video is going to be covering tiers 1 through 3. With all that being said, let's get into it. Tier 1 of this iceberg consists of compounds that are well known and widely integrated into society. Regardless of education on psychoactive drugs, almost everyone knows at least the baseline effects of these substances, and either knows people who indulge in them or uses them themselves. We aren't going to spend all that much time discussing these compounds, because they're so popular. However, we will still give a good amount of background information for these substances, because later entries on this list may have similar effects in which we can refer to these drugs. Starting off with arguably the most widely used drug in the world, we have alcohol. A compound so popular some of you may even be enjoying a drink as we speak. Humanity's relationship with alcohol is estimated to have begun around 7000 BCE, evident by discoveries of ancient equipment used in its processing. This is one of the earliest drugs in the history of the United States to have a renaissance in its restrictions to make it legal because people loved getting plastered so much. The chemical responsible for alcohol's perception-changing effects is ethanol. However, there are other forms of alcohol that are used for cleaning or fuel, such as methanol. The main effect of alcohol is disinhibition, meaning it lowers one's level of self-restraint, allowing a user to be more loose, open, or sociable. Alongside this effect, alcohol can cause free feelings, dissociation, relaxation, loss of motor coordination, less judgment in decisions, and ultimately, it has a depressant effect on the central nervous system. Now, for some reason, there is debate around if alcohol is also stimulating or just has depressant effects. Frankly, I don't know. I've researched this topic and have had it brought up in college classes, and I've heard contradictory information supporting the ideas of it being strictly a depressant or depressant and stimulant. but it does ultimately slow down respiration and other central nervous system activity, so just thought I'd mention that. Alcohol is frequently used as a social lubricant, and for celebrations, socialization, and, for better or for worse, coping with difficulties. Alcohol can cause hangovers, which seem to be due to a mixture of factors such as dehydration, chemical activity in the body, sleep interruption, and so on. Ultimately, despite alcohol's widespread usage, it does have a lot of danger associated with it. From addiction to blackouts to alcohol poisoning, alcohol can be a very powerful substance. A good example of this power is in the fact that alcohol is one of the only drugs that can straight up kill you if you haven't had a drink in long enough. With severe physical dependence, the withdrawals of alcohol can be deadly, especially if someone quits cold turkey, and often require medical assistance or intervention, along with other medications to help someone get through the withdrawals. Next up, we have another very widely used means of changing consciousness, being cannabis. Often the main chemical named for the effects cannabis produces is delta-9-THC. However, there are a plethora of different chemicals that contribute to the drug's effects. Now, there's evidence that points to human beings using cannabis around 2800 BC in China. Now, even though weed does have current medical acceptability, it is considered a Schedule I substance federally within the United States. And ooh-wee! Let's talk about the scheduling system in the US really quick. So, if a drug is psychoactive, it may become scheduled, meaning that it has a recognized status and subsequent restrictions based on how much merit the compound has medically, as well as its potential for abuse and addiction. Now, Schedule I is the most controlled category, and the substances within its ruling are considered too dangerous for any public access within any circumstances. It has no recognized medical usage and an incredibly high potential for abuse and addiction. A notable example of this scheduling is heroin, just to give you an idea of the type of beast we're talking about. Now, as previously mentioned, cannabis is sometimes recommended by medical professionals of all fields and disciplines for a wide array of different ailments and physiological challenges. However, despite its efficacy in helping improve appetite and help with conditions such as epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, different digestive issues, and ease the deeply negative side effects that chemotherapy has in those being treated for cancer, and the fact that it does not seem to cause severe physical dependence in most users, and does not cause on its own fatal overdoses, marijuana is Schedule I in the United States, which, regardless of your opinion on cannabis, I think we can all agree is silly at best. The roots of its prohibition can be traced to capitalistic greed, as well as aiming to enforce power on minority communities, which unfortunately will be a somewhat common theme for why certain plant-based drugs are made illegal. We'll continue to talk about the scheduling of drugs as we go on. Anyways though, back on track. Cannabis is often used to relax or enhance experiences. Now, the effects of cannabis can be highly variable, and different people may respond drastically differently to the drug, but some of the effects it may have include relaxation, giggling, increased appetite, dissociation, paranoia, and psychosis in extreme cases. Furthermore, marijuana is what I would consider an atypical psychedelic, which, don't worry, we will circle back to what that means in more detail as we progress further down the iceberg. But some of these surreal and ethereal-like effects can include a psychedelic-like change on perception, closed-eye visuals, vast disconnection from sober reality, visual or audible hallucinations, and a change in the way one experiences a given environment. This element is pretty hard to articulate, so if you don't know what I mean, just know that cannabis does have the potential to radically change one's perspective. Nevertheless, it is important to note that weed isn't fully benign. It can induce psychosis and can definitely be psychologically addictive. Additionally, some have reported experiencing physical withdrawal symptoms as well from weed, including insomnia, a general sense of discomfort, changes in appetite, or a sick feeling. Moreover, weed is especially bad for people who suffer from schizophrenia and greatly worsens their symptoms. Ultimately, cannabis should be better studied. Right now, it is not very well regulated in the United States because it is a Schedule 1 drug, which also makes it a lot harder to study and do research on. Alright, next up we have a fan favorite, which is caffeine. Now, human usage has been traced to the past 10,000 years. It is a central nervous system stimulant found in a multitude of plants like the coffee or tea plants. The main desired effect is wakefulness and increased alertness. However, with too much caffeine, it can cause shaking, anxiety, nausea, lightheadedness, and heart issues, either short or long term. Now, I know that previously I said that alcohol may be the most widely used drug in the world, but caffeine probably has it beat. Although alcohol's effects change perception a lot more, so I'm just going to call it a tie. Anyways, this is stupid. Both are super popular. Moving on. I will say caffeine is by far the most culturally integrated drug. You can find it at virtually every grocery, convenience store, or restaurant. Hell, you're even allowed to, if not encouraged, to use caffeine at work. Yeah, the coffee break is sometimes contractually mandated, meaning it would have to be provided. Honestly, there's a couple notable events that have contributed to the coffee break concept, but the one I'm just gonna talk about is what I think is the funniest and most profound event. In Denver during the mid-1900s at a tie manufacturing facility called Los Wigwam Weavers, which is a pretty sick name, you gotta admit. The workers were not being as productive as the owner, Phil Greinitz, was hoping. They convinced him to let them take breaks because the position was tiresome and he provided coffee. After some experimentation, he figured out that those who drank coffee made more ties, so he made the break mandatory. However, even though this break was forced, it wasn't paid. So his workers took him to court, and ultimately the court ruled that because the workers were more productive because of coffee, it had to be paid because it benefited the company. Summarizing a quote by Michael Pollan, your employer gives you a drug to work harder and you get paid for taking this drug. And that's capitalism. Rock on. Next up, we have a fiend favorite. Let me see what I did there. Which is nicotine. Now, this is the first drug I'm going to talk about that I feel like is incredibly polarizing. I think me mentioning nicotine either made your mouth water a little bit or you got a bit repulsed thinking about it. Unless you're like me and just don't really care. Represent. Human use of nicotine seems to have originated around 2,000 years ago, when it was typically used for ceremonies or special events. This is technically the deadliest drug in the world, or in other words, it causes the most deaths annually. It's not even close. Tobacco is very carcinogenic, and nicotine itself has a negative effect on the cardiovascular system. It has many routes of administration, such as smoked, sublingually absorbed, insufflated, or absorbed through the skin. Or I guess vaping for you wild kids out there. The effects of nicotine are a head rush or a lightheadedness, loss of motor coordination in high doses, and quasi-nootropic effects. In other words, it can help with focus and cognition. Nicotine is incredibly addictive and habit-forming. Compulsive redosing is very popular with nicotine. Now, nicotine's general popularity in society is partially due to incredibly innovative marketing techniques that the smoking industry pioneered, as well as its media portrayal. Even though the effects of tobacco on the body can be devastating, a lot of people just think it looks pretty dang cool. This is a drug that also keeps finding innovative ways to stay relevant, as is seen with how popular vaping is. Its usage is timeless, from it being given out as part of rations during World War I, to characters in popular media smoking cigarettes, using dip, or vaping. It just seems to find a way to maintain its place as a dangerous, sought-after aesthetic. Alright, now we're moving on to Tier 2, which includes drugs that are well known despite there being some prevalent misconceptions about their nature. Moreover, these drugs in particular are culturally taboo and seen as drugs of abuse. So the popularity of the drugs I placed in Tier 2 are much lower than those of Tier 1 and are highly addictive and socially ridiculed, but do have a lot of media portrayal. The first drug we will be discussing in Tier 2 is methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is a highly potent phenethylamine and is a CNS stimulant, obviously. It works through primarily acting as a dopamine receptor agonist. In other words, it releases a ridiculous amount of the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is often thought of as the reward chemical, which gets released in smaller amounts when eating or copulating to promote survival. Despite the highly addictive qualities of the drug, it is a Schedule II substance, meaning it does have recognized medical applications for extreme cases of, say, obesity or ADHD. So, medical meth does exist. The common routes of administration of methamphetamine are oral, insufflated, smoked, or intravenously injected. The effects of this drug include stimulation, euphoria, ego inflation, increased libido, alertness, appetite suppression, paranoia, thought acceleration, and insomnia. One of the reasons that methamphetamine is so addictive beyond the reported rush that it gives is how cheap and potent it is. A little bit goes a long way. Because meth can cause sleep deprivation, binges can result in extremely vivid hallucinations. From seeing shadow people follow you and tell you they know you're high, to seeing bugs crawl around in your skin. Typically, these hallucinations are not reported to be pleasant. It is also popularly synthesized by clandestine chemists in makeshift labs, which occasionally results in the lab exploding because of the volatile nature of the ingredients it uses. I will say there is an admirable level of dedication to finding new ways of synthesizing methamphetamine. Using roundabout methods to create the drug is a necessity, because many of the typically used ingredients are so greatly restricted or monitored so closely, which is the reason you might get ID'd when you're picking up Sudafed to alleviate the symptoms of a cold. Its most popular media representation, beyond the faces of meth posters and unrecognizable mugshots it's associated with, is the TV hit Breaking Bad, which personally I think does a stunning job of showcasing my hometown, Albuquerque, and the beautiful scenery of the Enchanted State. Next up, we're going to be discussing another fiend favorite, which is cocaine. Often viewed as a drug of luxury because of films like Wolf of Wall Street or its prevalence in casino bathrooms, cocaine is an alkaloid extract from the plant Athroxylin coca. Despite the leaves themselves acting as a stimulant that is more comparable to caffeine than that of a highly addictive, life-changing drug, the isolated chemical itself is a powerful CNS stimulant. Once again, obviously. Like methamphetamine, cocaine is listed as a Schedule II drug by the DEA, with medical use often focusing on its anesthetic and vasoconstricting properties. So, medical cocaine also exists. Beyond its ceremonial and wartime use, its history is also tied to several notable brands and public figures. For instance, you may have heard that the original Coca-Cola formula contained cocaine in its recipe and was advertised as a quote-unquote medical tonic, which, yeah, I'm sure it was. Furthermore, one of the founding fathers of modern psychology, who laid groundwork for what would eventually become actually scientific dogma instead of wild theories in the study of the human mind, Sigmund Freud, was an advocate for its use, claiming in papers that it was a cure for headaches, fatigue, and addiction to other substances. Now, while it may seem humorous nowadays that a clearly addictive drug would be used as a cure for another addictive drug, this is not the first nor the last example that we will cover in which one addiction was encouraged as a substitution for another. As a matter of fact, modern medical professionals still accidentally do this sometimes before the true addictive nature of a drug is fully uncovered. Besides, Sigmund Freud was alive in the period when the thought of a war with a large amount of the world's participation in it was viewed as a mere fan fiction. You live and you learn. Anyways, another notable organization that had involvements with cocaine is our never morally corrupt agency that aims to better the US in its endeavors, the CIA, which was confirmed to have trafficked cocaine into the country to destabilize minority communities, which is, not great. The effects of cocaine are stimulation, physical and cognitive euphoria, pain relief, vasoconstriction, numbing of the mouth, face, and throat, increased libido, and mania. It is commonly used through insufflation, absorption through the gums intravenously, and smoked. The form of cocaine that is smoked is often referred to as crack, a cheaper amalgamation of cocaine in which the high comes on more intensely but is shorter lived. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, cocaine itself is partially so addictive because the high is so fleeting, typically lasting for under an hour, which causes compulsive redosing. Now, it is frequently combined with alcohol, which, when processed by the liver, creates cocaethylene, which is a much more toxic compound to the body and its organs. As previously mentioned, cocaine is a status symbol because of its expensive cost. This has contributed to many celebrity addictions and overdoses. Some of the lives claimed in these tragic overdoses include Hollywood legends John Belushi and Chris Farley. The next entry on our list is quite a doozy: heroin, also known as diacetylmorphine. It was discovered in 1874 when C.A. Wright boiled morphine on his stove, as one does. However, most credit the commercial application of heroin to Heinrich Dresser in 1895, who created heroin while working for the Bayer Company in Germany. The medical uses of heroin were for pain relief, which was marketed as a substitute for morphine without those nasty, unwanted side effects like addiction. This was a selling point of heroin, so much so that it was actually used as a treatment for morphine addiction because it was believed to get rid of the withdrawal symptoms and wouldn't lead to further opioid addiction. And I told you we'd see the old substitution trick again. Also, side note, I hate how the word opioid is spelled. It is so hard for me to remember that it has two I's in it. It looks like an alien word, and I keep misspelling it. It is the bane of my existence. And I like to think I'm a good speller. Matter of fact, I was in the spelling bee numerous times as a kid. I never made it that far, but that's got to count for something. In fact, I can't even consistently spell this word without spell check. Is like if Neil deGrasse Tyson saw a physics problem and was just utterly stumped. Pretty much. Kinda. Regardless, the addictive nature of heroin, as you'd expect, quickly surfaced, and it was made illegal in the United States in 1924, when the thought of there being two wars that would involve a large amount of the world's participation seemed like mere fan fiction. Nevertheless, heroin remained an epidemic. During the Vietnam War, a large amount of soldiers experimented with heroin to help cope with the devastating reality of warfare. And upon returning home, roughly 20% of veterans remained addicted to narcotics post-Vietnam. And because of the reliance on intravenous usage of heroin, the HIV/AIDS epidemic impacted users who used unclean or shared needles, which further stigmatized the drug. The primary routes of administration for heroin are intravenous, smoked, and snorted, which is sometimes done through the combination of heroin with something like Benadryl and called cheese. And no, I am not making that up. The effects of heroin are sedation, cognitive and physical euphoria, pain relief, compulsive redosing, and respiratory depression. The common occurrence of nodding off, in which a user seemingly flows between a conscious and unconscious state, is said to be quasi-psychedelic, with vivid visions and dreamlike visuals being a prominent feature of this event. Finally, one especially unfortunate truth about heroin is that a notable percent of users were not previous drug users. During the hearty rise of opioid prescriptions that we will touch more on later, those who experienced pain and subsequently were prescribed painkillers like, say, oxycodone or hydrocodone became addicted to the pills and needed them as to not fall into the brutal withdrawal of opioids, which is often a several-week-long severe sickness riddled with devastating symptoms, and had to switch to heroin because it's cheaper and sometimes more available than other narcotics. Some of those who have had their lives ruined by this addiction could never have seen that getting treatment for their pain would result in a desolate cycle of substance abuse and damnation. Tier 3 consists of drugs that are on the public radar and have popular media that showcase them. You very well could probably recount some of the effects that a lot of these drugs have, and you may even know someone who has experimented with them. Most of these are illicit drugs. However, these all seem to have some level of misunderstandings related to their chemistry, the effects produced, their purpose, or facts about them. As such, they are less understood than previous entries, despite their prevalence culturally. The first drug in Tier 3 we will discuss is a pretty complex and wild one, so strap in, we have a lot to cover. This is also the first classical psychedelic we are going to be talking about, LSD. Really quickly, there is, for some reason, a good amount of confusion about LSD's name. Now, some people believe that LSD and acid are two separate drugs, which is not the case. The nickname acid is derived from the full chemical name of LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, not from it melting your brain or anything, contrary to some beliefs. Anyways, while there are countless psychedelic or psychedelic-like drugs, classical psychedelics fall under the chemical classes of tryptamines or phenethylamines, and typically are agonists of the 5-HT2A serotonin receptor. Now, I want to mention that psychedelics as a whole will probably all have a somewhat lengthy explanation tied to them because of the richness of their history and the fact that their effects are complex, to say the least. Plus, I think their presence in the world and the larger mysteries about being and consciousness that they uncover are incredibly fascinating and deserve attention and thoroughness. So, here we go. LSD is a chemical initially derived from ergot, a mold that often grows on grains and shares structural similarity to ergotine, which produces comparable effects, except is also poisonous. It was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann in 1938 when studying ergot. Its effects were discovered by complete accident when, while handling the chemical, Hofmann made contact with it through his skin, producing strange effects. 3 days later, he experimented with LSD by taking 215 micrograms of the chemical, which is a pretty high dose for starters, speaking threshold effects occur at 25 micrograms, and most blotter paper tablets contain only 75 to 125 micrograms of LSD. The drug was unexpectedly potent, and after the effects began to take hold, he rode home on his bicycle, solidifying the international holiday that takes place every April 19th, Bicycle Day. Celebrating that fateful day, a brave pioneer accidentally tripped sack and rode home in a panicky, psychedelic trance. In the description section of this video, I actually am including a link to a Change.org petition to make this a recognized and protected federal holiday that gives us time off work and school to appreciate the modest yet culturally shattering event. Not really. Anyways, Hoffman got home and was flooded with kaleidoscopic visuals, and fearing he may be in peril, called over a physician to make sure he was safe and okay. After finding no physiological abnormalities in his vitals, Hoffman went on to enjoy the rest of his evening and visual display. Eventually, LSD became sold internationally, partially being produced by the laboratory that Hoffman worked at, as a psychomimetic, or drug that mimics psychosis, as a means for clinicians and therapists to experience firsthand the symptoms of patients that had mental illnesses. However, as its more pleasant effects and transcendental realizations came to light, it became known as psychedelic, derived from the Greek words meaning mind manifesting. As time went on, the usage of LSD became widespread, which resulted in the counterculture of the 1960s. Its presence became associated with disruptive figures such as Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, Al Hubbard, and Aldous Huxley, along with others who were proponents of its potential. Notably, Timothy Leary spread the notion of cultural change through his slogan, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," to express his hopes for people to use LSD to change their perception and the social norms surrounding them. Other prominent figures who used this substance in the time included the Beatles, the Doors, and Jimi Hendrix. In part because of the anti-war sentiments shared by the counterculture, LSD was targeted by the federal government to quell protests surrounding U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. It became federally illegal in 1966, meaning possession, creation, or distribution of the drug could result in criminal proceedings. And in 1968, it was designated a Schedule I drug. However, despite its scheduling, LSD does not cause physical dependency, and most users do not try to use this drug daily or frequently at all. Which isn't to say that some people don't. I'm looking at you deadheads, you beautiful psychedelic rebels. Once again, though, being placed in the Schedule I category meant that no further medical research could take place without heaps of hoops to jump through for researchers. Which I thought was a pretty creative way to say. All medical research was almost put to a complete standstill. Albeit, while the general public and medical professionals were dissuaded and prosecuted for using LSD, our shining protagonists, the CIA, still had fun employing the chemical in experiments to create sleeper agents and cause brainwashing and mind control in their famous project, MKUltra. Which, I will give them points for the name because it does sound pretty badass. I mean, MKUltra, that's a pretty sick name. Straight out of a sci-fi movie or something. Yeah. Moving on to the routes of administration, it is typically taken sublingually or orally. However, you may recall, it also can be absorbed through the skin. Now, the effects of LSD can be highly variable and unpredictable and seem to rely on set and setting or the mentality and environment of a user. Also, the effects of psychedelics seem to be the most difficult to describe of any drug class because they are so boundary dissolving that language struggles to capture the experience. But some of the effects it can have are stimulation, euphoria, bodily lightness, tactile enhancement, increased body temperature, yawning, increased visual acuity, introspection, emotional intensity, insights or grand understandings of the universe, ego loss, time distortion, a sense of connectedness, color enhancement, and synesthesia, in which multiple senses can overlap. This effect encapsulates some users' recounted experiences of being able to, say, see sounds, taste colors, or any combination of two or more senses coming together into one experience. Additionally, I want to say that the visuals of LSD are often misunderstood, as are a lot of psychedelics. They typically are not full-blown hallucinations in which something exists before you that isn't actually present in sober reality. Rather, LSD seems to work by causing distortions to the senses, such as changing pitch of sounds or causing the world to look as if it is animate. Seeing objects or environments breathe, melt, or flow, or seeing walls covered in geometric imagery are common, as well as having changes in depth perception or tracers of actions being performed. LSD can also cause closed-eye visuals, demonstrating visions or animations when you close your eyes. Many of these effects are theorized to occur because of the change in brain activity psychedelics can cause. For instance, when looking at an fMRI scan of the brain on someone who has ingested LSD, it seems that many parts of the brain that typically work independently communicate openly with others, with many parts of the brain lighting up concurrently. Moreover, LSD is seen promise as a means of treating addiction, initially advocated by Bill Wilson, one of the founding members of AA, and coming to terms with traumas or imminent death in terminal patients. Ultimately, though it is an incredibly fascinating compound with a rich history, it shouldn't be taken lightly. The experience of LSD can be unbelievably intense, and the quote-unquote come-up can be very uncomfortable. The effects can last 8 to 12 hours, and it is a profoundly powerful drug that demands respect and often requires a user to completely give up control. Next up on our list, we're going to be covering the other most well-known classical psychedelic, LSD's fungal cousin, psilocybin, which also has a lot to talk about, and we're covering this directly following LSD because their histories are largely intertwined, at least in their social recognition in the West during the 1900s. Psilocybin is a naturally occurring chemical within the aptly named psilocybin mushrooms. While typically the mushroom Psilocybe cubensis is the main topic of discussion, psilocybin is found in several other species of mushroom, such as Psilocybe azurescens and Psilocybe mexicana in varying amounts. Psychedelic mushrooms have evidently been used for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years by people and potentially other primates in our lineage. There are several fascinating theories about the origins of humanity's relationship with psilocybin, many of which being posed by one of mushroom's most vocal advocates, Terence McKenna. McKenna is a household name for psychedelic and philosophical enthusiasts alike, authoring, alongside his brother Dennis, one of the earliest do-it-yourself mushroom growing instruction manuals titled Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide in 1976. McKenna's theories range from mushrooms being a catalyst for lingual communication spread throughout the universe by highly evolved aliens to his famous stoned ape theory, originally acting as an explanation for how early primates evolved into modern-day humans and how the brain experienced a period of rapid growth evolutionarily. The theory has been refined into the belief that mushrooms influenced an explosive increase in human culture, technology, and language. Some of the evidence presented for this theory include that early nomadic peoples followed herds of cattle, in which psilocybin mushroom grow in their excrement. Plus, psilocybin does cause an increase in the language areas of our brain. Furthermore, it has been posed that taking psilocybin mushrooms could have been a form of adaptation, as it can increase visual acuity and cause stimulation, and could have been an effective tool for hunting in lower dosages. Which, whether or not this is a large contributing factor in humanity's cultural evolution, you gotta admit, it's a pretty cool theory. The idea that life as you know it came from our ancestors getting high on mushrooms and having a cultural revolution is pretty sick. Tripping sack saves the day. Now, but if not just impacting human nature as we are, it certainly influenced ancient spirituality and religions in parts of the world. Regardless, the effects of psilocybin mushrooms were rediscovered by the Western world in the 1950s, meaning that within the United States, LSD was actually utilized a decade before we ever knew about its purely naturally grown counterpart. When R. Gordon Wasson published an article that appeared in Life magazine titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom. Soon after, a mycologist named Roger Heim collected samples that he sent then to Albert Hofmann, the creator of LSD, for analysis. Hoffman was able to identify psilocybin as the psychoactive agent within these mushrooms and isolated it, selling it internationally to clinicians under the name Indocybin. In 1960, Timothy Leary, who was one of LSD's greatest social revolutionists, had an experience with psilocybin in Mexico, which sparked his interest in psychedelics as a whole. He was elated with the compound and its groundbreaking potential in understanding human psychology, later remarking to his colleagues that he, quote, learned more about his brain and its possibilities and more about psychology in the 5 hours after taking these mushrooms than he had in the preceding 15 years of studying and doing research in psychology. This resulted in the creation of the Harvard Psilocybin Project, with aid from Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzner. This study was meant to only be conducted on graduate students. However, scrutiny began to arise after it was discovered that Leary had been distributing psilocybin to undergraduate students, which resulted in the staff involved in these projects being terminated. Ultimately, restrictive laws were introduced after public use began to grow, causing psilocybin to be placed in the Schedule I category alongside LSD. Albeit despite being forced underground, its usage and interest remained. Similarly to LSD, many influential pop culture icons utilize psilocybin at some point in their lives. More recently, I'm sure you've heard about the publicized research that has been appearing over the past few years regarding psilocybin's potential as a therapeutic agent for psychedelic-assisted therapy. Many of these studies initially were performed at Johns Hopkins, in which experiments involving terminal cancer patients were ran as a means of helping them come to terms with their lives and, unfortunately, their upcoming demises. Because of psilocybin's ability to assist in alleviating the torments of stress and depression these patients experienced because of their condition, psilocybin's potential has finally been recognized again after half a century of being banished from the larger society in America. Now, certain states in the US have begun decriminalizing psychedelic mushrooms, and a future of integrated psychedelic-assisted therapy is just on the horizon. With all that being said, let's get into the effects of psilocybin, which include neurogenesis, or the reconstruction or creation of new neural pathways, sensations of bodily heaviness, nausea, yawning, color enhancement, visual acuity, breathing or melting visuals of the environment, symmetrical texture replication, perceptual and depth perception distortions, closed-eye visuals, a feeling of connectedness, enhancement of emotions, increased empathy and affection, synesthesia, analysis enhancement, euphoria, catharsis, time dilation, ego loss, and feelings of existential self-realization. Once again, though, the experiences mushrooms provide can be unimaginably intense and uncomfortable at times. Sense setting is highly important. Alright, now that we got that essay out of the way, let's talk about our favorite poppy's favorite product, opium. Now, this is not meant to be confused with copium, or the lies we tell ourselves to not face the harsh realities of pain and defeat. Like telling yourself that your pet kitty cat knows you didn't mean to step on their tail. It was dark. They know you didn't mean to. Oh God. What if they don't know? Oh man. Oh! Opium is one of the OG opioids. Actually, the word opiate and opioid stem from the opium itself, both words meaning substances either naturally occurring or synthetically created that hold similarities to opium. Opium, for the last time I'm going to use that word for a second, is typically tied to the plant Papaver somniferum, and is suspected to have been used for its narcotic properties for roughly 7,000 or 8,000 years. The constituents of the poppy flower were used medicinally, ritualistically, and, let's be honest, definitely recreationally. I mean, what else was there to do but, conquer and survive? Now, opium was especially used by the Chinese in the 1800s. Part of this issue stems from the fact that England really wanted continuous trade with China, but China wasn't super interested in trading for silver that the English had. So next best thing. Britain began supplying opium to the Chinese people as a valuable commodity. And Britain really liked this deal. As a matter of fact, when the Chinese government aimed to reform their society to minimize or eradicate the widespread addiction to opium, it caused a war with England. After losing this war, the population of China continued to abuse the drug until finally, a series of Chinese leaders decided to put a stop to it all and began the rehabilitation process for their nation, which caused there to be a second opium war. Now, did I mention the British really liked the whole giving China opium thing? The Chinese wouldn't actually be free of their bind to opium and the British until the 1950s. Now, during America's earlier days, opium was relatively widely prescribed. It seemed like a panacea, the remedy for almost any illness, which, once again, I bet it helped. Opium was widely given out for injuries, notably during the American Civil War, in which close to 200,000 pounds of opium powders and tinctures and hundreds of thousands of opium pills were used. Allegedly, soldiers called opium God's own medicine, which is so funny, but technically true. Opium can be snorted, injected, or smoked. The range of effects it produces include relaxation, physical and cognitive euphoria, reduced anxiety, sleepiness, decreased libido, compulsive redosing, pain relief, respiratory depression, and similarly to heroin, closed-eye visuals or visions in high doses. Nowadays, opium is largely overshadowed by other narcotic drugs that can be more potent and easily created. The next drug we're going to cover shares a lot of similarities to opium, which is morphine. Morphine is also a native chemical to the Papaver somniferum. It was first isolated around 1804 by European name Friedrich Sertiner? ? However, as it is also contained in the poppy plant, its usage has been present for thousands of years. The name morphine was derived from the Greek god Morpheus, who is the god of dreams, because of morphine's sedative properties. Another interesting fact about the word morphine is it in part constructs the term endorphin, which means endogenous morphine. This is because endorphins, which are the natural painkillers produced by the human body, have great similarities in effects to morphine. Furthermore, a large percentage of morphine that is produced is used as a means of creating other more potent narcotics such as hydrocodone, oxycodone, and all the other fun painkillers that led to the opiate epidemic, so shout out to them. In the mid-1800s, morphine became more widely used as it produced stronger effects than opium in pain relief and cough suppression. Plus, this was right around the time that the hypodermic needle was discovered, so blasting this into veins became an easy way to almost immediately treat pain. In its early days, it was, and stop me if you've heard this one before, also used as a means of treating opium addiction, and supposedly was just like opium, but stronger and without as many nasty addictive side effects. Although this was one of the earliest examples of treating an addiction with a more addictive drug, so it gets a pass, even though we never really learned from this mistake. Plus, this was a time when there was an open market for selling human beings in the United States, so yeah, definitely don't expect them to have all their ducks in a row. Like most opiates, with the exclusion of heroin, morphine is a Schedule II substance. The routes of administration for morphine include orally, insufflated, intravenously, smoked, and intrathecally, which means injected into the spinal canal, which, oh god. An interesting fact about morphine is that it suffers from a relatively low bioavailability, meaning the human body typically cannot absorb all that much orally and even less when insufflated. However, there have been studies conducted when combining morphine and chitosan, a supplement that is a type of fiber that comes from the shell of crustaceans, to increase the bioavailability of insufflated morphine, which works incredibly well, nearly tripling the effectiveness of snorted morphine for patients with pain. The effects of morphine are pretty much the same as opium and heroin. They include sedation, physical and cognitive euphoria, muscle relaxation, decreased libido, nausea, pain relief, pupil constriction, respiratory depression, compulsive redosing, irritability, and close-eyed visuals. Along with opium, morphine was a widely administered drug during the Civil War, causing addiction to it being coined as the soldier's disease. Finally, a note on morphine, but most narcotics in general, more or less, is that ingesting grapefruit when on the drug could be a fatal mistake. This is because the enzyme CYP3A4, which greatly helps break down opioids, can be temporarily inhibited by grapefruit. However, this effect is unpredictable as its severity depends on certain factors, including an individual's amount of the enzyme in their body. I'm not going to fully dive into the science behind this effect, but just keep it in mind. Okay, because I want to take a break from talking about opiates for a second, let's talk about an entactogenic phenethylamine, MDMA. Now, for some reason there is also some confusion on the name of MDMA. Some people believe that MDMA, ecstasy, and Molly are not all the same, even though, in theory, it is all referring to the same chemical, just sometimes in different forms or potentially cut with other drugs as well. Just putting that out there for anyone who may not be fully aware of that. To kickstart our one-sided dialogue about this fascinating compound, I'm going to read one of the introductory lines about MDMA straight from the Psychonaut Wiki verbatim because it aptly summarizes a good bit of its history pretty well, and frankly, I don't think I could say it better myself. MDMA was first developed in 1912 by the pharmaceutical company Merck. However, human use was not reported until the 1970s, when it became known to underground psychotherapy circles in the United States. In the early 1980s, it spread into nightlife and rave culture, which eventually resulted in federal scheduling in 1985. Boom. I mean, what else do you want to know? I say we're ready to move on. Except that we're not. So, For one, we need to discuss one of the most highly influential figures in causing MDMA to resurface after so many years of dormancy, Alexander Sasha Shulgin. And if you aren't aware of his insane impact in the history of drug synthesis, keep his name in mind for now, as he was a pioneer in developing novel psychedelic drugs. This guy's a legend. Anyways, he in part was largely influential in MDMA's roots as an aid in therapy. After discovering its immense potential as a means for dealing with trauma, Shulgin distributed MDMA to a psychotherapist named Leo Zeff, who quickly began spreading the word and the chemical to hundreds of other therapists for usage during sessions with certain clients who could benefit from its properties. Along with some psychedelics, MDMA has also seen a recent resurgence in clinical usage for helping in the therapy process, specifically for PTSD. This is because one of the qualities MDMA holds is allowing the user a deep state of comfort and easement, making traumatic experiences less stressful to revisit and more comfortable to work through. So, how does it work, you may ask? Firstly, thanks for asking. I appreciate your curiosity, you beautiful bastard. MDMA operates by causing a massive influx in the body's release of serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. This results in an incredibly euphoric experience. However, it also means that the come down for MDMA can be particularly brutal, as it basically just dumps out all of the feel-good neurotransmitters we have on hand. Additionally, tolerance with MDMA builds rapidly, resulting in users often reporting that it can lose its magic. MDMA can have quasi-psychedelic properties as well as causing stimulation in the central nervous system. The primary routes of administration for this drug are orally and nasally, which I'm just now realizing the word nasally is utterly terrible and I hate it. Yeah. The effects of MDMA include dehydration, tingling sensations, physical and cognitive euphoria, dry mouth, stimulation, tactile enhancement, excessive yawning, pupil dilation, nystagmus, or the spontaneous wiggling of the eyes back and forth, teeth grinding, color enhancement, tracers, and geometric visuals. Now, there's a couple of these I want to touch on in more detail. Foremost, tactile enhancement along with physical euphoria are highly prominent features of the MDMA experience, which is why at a festival you may encounter a wide-eyed, teeth-grinding madman rubbing a blanket or some sort of fabric against their face while smiling so widely you'd think it's the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland. Now, additionally, dehydration is a big one that needs a lot of consideration. So, MDMA alone causes dehydration because it's a powerful stimulant, so more water than usual is needed to support the body's efforts. However, there has also been cases where overhydration takes place because people so desperately do not want to be dehydrated, which can be equally dangerous. Too much water can swell the brain, causing intense headaches or even death. Because MDMA can be a popular party drug, as it can cause deep feelings of interconnectedness and love, people need to be aware of the risks that MDMA can pose on hydration and well-being when in already hot temperatures with the excess stimulation of the body. With that, serotonin is a key agent in regulating body temperature, so even though the body's temperature can increase, some people feel cold because of MDMA's intense catalyzation of serotonin, causing them to turn up heaters or add more blankets and ultimately overheating. Alright, back to opiate business. Let's talk about an increasingly notorious compound that is utterly terrifying if it gets into the wrong hands: fentanyl. Now, I'm a firm believer that there's no such thing as an evil drug. They're just chemicals, and fentanyl is no exception. It does have medical merit, and its initial synthesis came from a place of good intentions. But because of how ridiculously potent it is, its potential for serious damage can be high. However, some of the fear surrounding the drug comes from popular misconceptions. There have been widespread news stories stating that dollar bills or door handles that have residue of the powder on them are a nationwide threat, albeit a simple search of the facts on this phenomenon dispel these claims. While it can be absorbed through the skin through specific patches, casual contact with these compounds don't seem to be an incredibly deadly phenomenon. Rather, overdoses from its potency are much more common. Moreover, a lot of its notoriety stems from it being cut into other drugs, causing fatal overdoses on usually not fatal amounts of what people believe they are ingesting. Some of these devastating overdoses include Jay Bennett, Coolio, Lil Peep, Mac Miller, and Prince, which, damn, dude, so much talent ripped away from the world. However, once again, it's not the fault of the drug itself, rather the unfortunate consequences of human nature. An easy way to counteract ingesting drugs that might be laced with fentanyl or anything else are reagent kits, either done at home or through several drug testing labs. A reagent kit on its own cannot tell you exactly what is in a compound without further chemical analysis, but it can help you understand what drugs might or might not be present. They work by taking a sample of the drug and using the reagent kit to see what color the sample turns, which corresponds with a labeled color palette. Now, if you or someone you know enjoys taking recreational drugs that are not regulated, this is one of the greatest harm reduction practices available. Drugs like MDMA, cocaine, LSD, heroin, or other opiates, and so on have been commonly cut with other drugs that are either cheaper or more potent. In the instance of fentanyl, it was even spread into certain batches of heroin as a sales tactic, believe it or not, so that the dealer's product could be known as causing overdoses, which, in the world of heroin use, may make the product seem like it's reputable for strength. Wild stuff. Anyways though, fentanyl was initially synthesized in 1960 by Paul Janssen and quickly became useful as a general anesthetic and pain reliever. Fentanyl has a wide range of routes of administration. It can be prescribed or used recreationally, intravenously, orally, sublingually, through sprays or even lollipops, transdermal through skin patches, or snorted or smoked. Now, the dosage for fentanyl is ridiculously low, having a threshold dose orally as low as 5 micrograms. As such, it is also important to note that there is a life-saving chemical that can quickly, though temporarily, reverse the effects of an opiate overdose, which can be administered through a nasal spray known as naloxone or Narcan. It can also be administered intravenously. The effects of fentanyl seem to provide less euphoria when compared to other common narcotics. However, that isn't to say it still doesn't provide a pleasurable experience to the user. The common effects of fentanyl include sedation, physical and cognitive euphoria, respiratory depression, decreased blood pressure, pain relief, double vision, and compulsive redosing. Now, I know I just previously stated that there are no evil drugs. However, the final one we're going to be covering in today's video completely disproves that idea. You may be wondering what drug could be so malicious, so foul, so outright horrible that it makes fentanyl look like a saint and makes even Satan quiver in his boots. Assuming he wears boots. I don't know, maybe he's more of a galosh type of guy. Regardless, you haven't known pure treachery until you've discovered the sheer hatred of theobromine. Gasps. That's right. What makes this substance so absolutely terrible, you may ask? It is the reason that dogs can't safely enjoy chocolate. Fuck you, theobromine. Yeah, theobromine is a common alkaloid that can be found in the cocoa plant, along with plenty of other plant species. And because dogs have trouble digesting it, it's one of the main factors why chocolate is so toxic to pups. And despite its widespread consumption and presence as a precursor in certain cosmetics, there seems to be a poor understanding of it as a whole within the general populace. Theobromine is relatively similar to caffeine, acting as a slightly stimulating compound. Theobromine was first discovered in 1841 by a Russian chemist named A. Voskresensky. Saying that name relatively correctly just took me like 5 takes for some reason. A. Voskresensky. A. Voskresensky. A. Voskresensky. A. Waskrenensky. The name theobromine actually comes from theobroma, a combination of Greek words that translates to food of the gods, referring to the cocoa plant because chocolate is rad. The common dosage of theobromine is around 250 to 500 milligrams, and it is typically consumed orally. As stated before, the effects greatly mirror those of caffeine, but it also does some other cool stuff like lower blood pressure and strengthen tooth enamel. Alright, I guess this drug isn't so bad, despite its crimes against dogmanity. That about does it. Those are the first 3 tiers of the drug iceberg I created, although I'm sure you can tell we are just barely scratching the surface of psychoactive compounds, and the next tiers are going to be unveiling increasingly obscure, fascinating, and wild drugs that most people seem to be relatively unaware of or have misconceptions regarding them. If you made it this far, just know I really appreciate you checking this out. I think drugs and psychopharmacology are some of the most interesting elements of conscious experience, and I absolutely love learning about them, and I hope you do too. Now, this project has taken me a good bit of time to kickstart and work on, and we will have over 100 other chemical compounds I want to touch on, so stay tuned as we continue to delve into the rich history and documented effects of all sorts of different chemicals. The next few tiers are a lot lengthier, so be excited for that. Although, keep in mind this is just a basic summary of these compounds, so if you're interested in learning more about them, there's plenty more facts and mysteries to uncover. Anyways, thanks for watching, I love you, be safe, and as always, one of the longest words in the English dictionary is phloxinoxyahilipilification. Peace. Now, even though weed does have current medical acceptability, it is a Schedule 1 substance federally. And, let's talk about the scheduling system